Let's get started. I work as a relocation assistant, essentially helping families move across the country when they get transferred. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with your location and the time you're watching. This way, YouTube will continue to show you stories like this one. Although the hotels aren't always 5-star, I get to travel for work, and last October, I was in Phoenix assisting the Morrison family with their move after his company relocated him from Detroit. The entire process typically takes a week or so, and I had booked myself into things like finding schools for the kids and arranging for utilities. The first night went well in this inexpensive hotel on the outskirts of town called the Desert Palms Inn. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, enough and close to the family's temporary stay. Room 237 on the second floor, with a view of the parking lot, had this terrible burgundy carpet with gold patterns. I unpacked my belongings, ordered takeout, and called it a night. The Morrisons had that generic hotel art on the walls, and the entire place smelled faintly of industrial cleaner, mixed with something I couldn't quite place. I'd stayed in worse places, so I didn't think much of it. The type was probably installed sometime in the 90s and was never replaced. The second night was when everything began. I had spent the day running around with Mrs. Morrison, looking at grocery stores and pediatricians. By the time I returned to the hotel at around 8 p.m., I had completed the typical settling in routine and had to get up early because they had scheduled a school tour for their youngest the following morning. The left heel of my black pumps, which I always wear to work, caught on something as I was going to the restroom because my feet were killing me. At first, I assumed it was just a loose thread or perhaps the carpet was coming up at the seam. But when I bent down to check what had caught my shoe, I saw the corner of curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed the corner with both hands. The carpet near the window was definitely lifted, not just loosely lifted, like someone had pulled it up before and tried to press it back down. The old glue gave way, making this terrible ripping sound as the carpet peeled back more easily than it should have. The subfloor beneath was covered in dark reddish-brown stains that appeared to have seeped deeply into the wood. These stains weren't just surface stains. They spread out in irregular patterns that reminded me of spilled wine, except that wine doesn't leave that particular color after it dries. The sight of the sore beneath made my stomach turn in a way I'll never forget. I've helped families clean out harder houses before, so I'm not squeamish, but something about those marks made my skin crawl. The smell I'd noticed when I first checked in was stronger here, too. That underlying odor beneath the industrial cleaner made me sit back on my heels and stare at those stains for as long as it seemed like forever. The pattern was too specific, too concentrated in one place, with those telltale splatter marks around the edges. I'd seen enough crime documentaries to know what dried blood looks like. It was probably only a few minutes, but my brain kept trying to think of innocent explanations. Perhaps someone had spilled paint, or perhaps water damage from a burst pipe mixed with rust. The hotel had recently placed new carpet over it after it had been sitting 4 years, so I took out my phone and took a number of pictures, making sure to capture the entire area of the discolored area, as well as some close-ups demonstrating the extent of the discoloration. The flash made the stains appear even darker, almost black in some places, and my hands weren't steady, so I had to take each picture twice to ensure it came out clearly. After that, I pressed the carpet back. The next morning, I marched down to the front desk with my phone in hand, ready to show the manager what I'd found. The man behind the counter was maybe 22, with greasy hair and a name tag that said, "I'm snooping around." I continued to look at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and catch me snooping around. Carl hardly looked up from his computer screen when I explained that the carpet had come loose and what was underneath. He mentioned that old hotels have various stains under the flooring that could be anything from coffee spills to pet accidents from decades ago. When I insisted that these looked like blood stains, he simply shrugged and said housekeeping would look into it later. His contemptuous dismissal of me strengthened my resolve to discover what had transpired in that room. That evening, I returned to my room feeling agitated and frustrated. The Morrisons had occupied me throughout the day with utility transfers and insurance paperwork, but I couldn't stop thinking about those stains. Every time I passed that corner of the room, I experienced an odd knot in my chest, so I made the decision to post the pictures were posted on a local Phoenix Facebook group with the simple caption, "I found some old stains under the carpet in my hotel room. Does anyone know if this place has any history I should be aware of?" Within an hour, I received dozens of comments, ranging from light-hearted jokes about looking for bed bugs to more serious advice about calling the health department. A woman named Linda Martinez wrote, "Oh my God, is that room 237? My cousin used to work housekeeping there in the early 2000s, and she always said that room gave her the creeps. Management made her clean it extra thoroughly every time, as if they were trying to erase unpleasant memories." These comments were the usual social media chatter, but one in particular caught my attention. I responded, requesting more information, but Linda never got back to me. By the time I went to bed that night, the post had been shared more than 50 times, and the comments were becoming increasingly crass. People were speculating about everything from domestic abuse gone wrong to mob hits. When I woke up the following morning, my phone was buzzing with a call. Detective Amanda Hayes from the Phoenix Police Department called from an unidentified local number. She asked if I was the person who had uploaded pictures of stains in room 237 at the Desert Palms Inn. After I confirmed that I was, there was a lengthy pause before she stated that she needed to talk to me face to face right away. There was something in her tone, made it apparent that this was not a standard follow-up call. She asked me to bring my phone with the original photos and meet her at a coffee shop across the street from the hotel in 2 hours. Detective Hayes, who turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with short grey hair and the sleepy eyes you see on people who have worked to many challenging cases, ordered a black coffee and got right to the point. Room 237 had been the site of a double homicide in March 2003, where a young couple named Jennifer Walsh and Michael Chen were staying for a weekend getaway. They were attacked early in the morning, and both of them died from multiple stab wounds. Years of investigation and multiple suspects later, the case was never solved. But what made my discovery noteworthy was that the detective explained that after the investigation was finished, the hotel had allegedly completely renovated the room, including replacing all of the flooring. It was obvious that they had simply thrown new carpets over the old subfloor without doing any proper remediation. She showed me some of the original crime scene photos on her tablet, and they showed the exact same stain pattern I had photographed beneath the carpet. The similarities were obvious. Detective Hayes stated that my photos were actually clearer than some of the evidence shots they'd taken 22 years ago, because the stains had been photographed fresh back then with all the other blood evidence cluttering the scene. The main concentration of stains, the scattered droplets, and even a distinctive elongated mark near what would have been the foot of the bed all matched perfectly. She asked me to keep the photos and my discovery quiet while they made decisions. It seems that there's been some renewed interest in the case lately, with new DNA testing techniques and some tips that have surfaced after a podcast last year covered the murders. My discovery might help them properly reopen the investigation, or even persuade a judge to grant new search warrants for parts of the room that hadn't been carefully inspected the first time. So I agreed to help, but I also told her that I wanted to switch hotels right away because I couldn't bear to sleep in the same room where two people had been brutally murdered, especially now that I knew the specifics. The issue began that same evening, after I had moved to a holiday inn across town and was assisting Mrs. Morrison organize her kitchen when I received the first Facebook message, which said, I should mind my own business and delete those photos. Before I stirred up things better left buried, I initially assumed it was just an internet troll who had seen my original post, but it felt different to specific, to personal. An hour later, I received another message from a different fake account, this one from Truthseeker47, saying that I didn't know what I was doing, and that some secrets were meant to remain secret. I received 6 more messages from different anonymous accounts after I left the Morrisons and returned to my new hotel room. They all repeated the same theme, warning me to remove the pictures and forget what I had discovered. The last one was the most disturbing. Jennifer and Michael believed they were safe too. Phoenix has a long memory, and some people dislike being reminded of past mistakes, so I took a screenshot of every message and sent it to Detective Hayes right away. She called me back in 20 minutes, her voice more tense than it had been during our coffee meeting, and she told me to call 911 if I received any more threats. The investigation was undoubtedly being people always told me that retirement would be dull, but no one warned me that it could be dangerous. At 62, after 30 years with the Dallas Police Department, I assumed the most exciting part of my life would be choosing between cable channels. That changed on a gloomy February day when I found myself at the Lonia Motor Lodge, at a remote area of East Texas. The cheapest extended stay option we found was this place, a throwback to the 1970s with faded turquoise paint and a neon sign that only partially worked. I was recovering from knee replacement surgery that went sideways, but my daughter Sarah insisted that I couldn't stay alone in my apartment because she lived in California and couldn't take time off work. My room was on the 2nd floor, and the owner, a rough-and-tumble man named Pete, gave me a monthly rate that wouldn't deplete my pension. What surprised me was how quickly the place would remind me why I'd spent 30 years solving puzzles that other people didn't want to pay attention to. The Lone Star sat on a section of Highway 59 where the only activity was truck drivers getting coffee and the occasional family stopping for the night between somewhere and nowhere else. It had about 20 units, half of which were empty most of the time, and it overlooked the parking lot and the diner that served breakfast until noon. The carpet was that industrial brown color that hides stains, and the air conditioner sounded like it was slowly dying, but it was clean enough, and Pete kept the place safe with cameras in the parking lot and good locks on the doors. During the first week, I had already established a routine that included physical therapy exercises in the morning, reading mystery novels in the afternoon, and watching the evening news while ordering takeout from the diner. The painkillers made everything seem a little surreal, as if I were witnessing my life unfold for someone else. The housekeeper was a petite woman named Elena, who couldn't have been older than 25, and had dark hair that was always pulled back in. Elena cleaned my room every other day, always knocking softly and asking permission before entering. She was thorough but quick, replacing towels and straightening things without engaging in conversation beyond polite greetings. She had a tight bun and these huge brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. She also had a soft Mexican accent and a way of moving through the hallways like she was trying not to disturb the air itself. Elena didn't strike me as the shy type. The room next to mine, 237, had been empty for my first 2 weeks at the motel, and then one night in late February, I heard voices through the thin walls. What struck me first was that she never looked directly at anyone, not at me, Pete, or the other guests. In my experience, people who avoid eye contact are either extremely shy or extremely afraid. Unusual except that these voices were in Spanish, speaking urgently and in hushed tones that carried the kind of tension I'd learned to recognize from working cases for years. The conversation lasted for about an hour, and it sounded like at least 3 different people, if not more. One voice was obviously that of a woman who was crying softly in between words that I couldn't make out. Another was a man speaking in. Elena came to clean my room early the following morning, and when I asked her casually about the guests next door, her face went completely blank, saying, "I don't know nothing." The third bursts with sharp commands, but the tone was desperate and pleading. When I pressed my ear to the wall to get more details, Everything went silent. "Concerning that room," she uttered, but her voice faltered as she did so. Over the course of the following few days, the pattern became evident. Room 237 would be quiet during the day, but voices would start to appear over 10 p.m. Always varying combinations of I began recording times and what little I could see through the walls in a notebook. And on Tuesday night, I heard what sounded like instructions, being given something about tomorrow and the truck. On Wednesday, I heard someone sobbing, but it sounded muffled, like they had their face pressed into a pillow. On Thursday night, there was my detective instincts, which had lain dormant for months, began to fire on all cylinders when I heard a woman's high, panicked voice repeatedly saying no in English, followed by a man's voice saying something harsh in Spanish that made her go silent. Eleanor's behavior became more bizarre as she began cleaning my room at strange hours throughout the week. Sometimes as early as 7 a.m. or as late as 6 p.m. she worked with anxious energy, constantly looking toward the door and jumping at any little noise. One afternoon, I caught her in the hallway outside room 237, simply standing there with her cleaning cart. I saw her in the parking lot that evening, talking to a heavy-set man in a pickup truck with Nevada plates. Their conversation was heated, with Eleanor shaking her head repeatedly as the man pointed toward the second floor. When I moved to get a better look, the man saw me and climbed back into his truck. She was staring at the door as if she was trying to see through it, and when she saw me watching, she practically ran to the elevator. When I asked Pete directly about the visitors, he said it was a family passing through staying for a few weeks, while they looked for permanent housing. But families don't whisper in the dark like conspirators, and they don't have different voices every night. Additionally, Pete's explanation for the activity in 237 didn't add up either. People would go upstairs for an hour or two, and then leave without any luggage or signs that anyone actually lived in that room. The entire setup screamed temporary meeting place, not temporary housing. And by the second week of unusual activity, I'd seen the same car parked outside the building twice. Various vehicles arrived after dark, including beat-up sedans, work vans, and occasionally a pickup truck, but they never stayed long. Began scheduling my visits to the ice machine to coincide with the evening arrivals. The majority of the people I saw were young, mostly women, and they all wore the same outfit. Eleanor did, that cautious blankness that results from being afraid to express emotion. They typically moved in small groups, accompanied by one or two men who were always on guard and constantly checking their phones. One night, I saw a girl who couldn't have been older than 16 wearing. The breakthrough occurred on a rainy Thursday night when I heard Eleanor's voice coming from room 237. She was wearing clothes that didn't fit properly and shoes that were falling apart. She looked up at me as she passed, and her eyes held a kind of desperation I'd seen too many times in my career. The man with her noticed the exchange and quickly steered her away, but not before giving me a long, hard stare that carried the unmistakable message, "Mind your own business." I could tell she was arguing with someone when she spoke Spanish, but her tone was different. It wasn't the careful, quiet way she spoke during the day. Instead, it was urgent and pleading. A man's voice interrupted her, speaking in rapid-fire Spanish that sounded like threats. Then Eleanor's voice became higher and almost teary, and I realized for sure that they were just kids. The realization struck me like a physical blow, and all of the strange interactions suddenly made terrible sense. I spent the rest of that night pacing my room, trying to decide what to do. What I was dealing with was not smuggling drugs or stolen goods, but human trafficking, and Eleanor wasn't just a witness, she was trapped in it, likely being forced to help manage the victims or keep them quiet. I wanted to call the local police, but something stopped me. In small towns like this, corruption can be pervasive, and if the wrong people were tipped off, the evidence would vanish and the victims would be relocated before anyone could assist them. I also didn't have any concrete evidence, just overheard conversations and suspicious behavior, and any good lawyer could disprove what I had seen. I needed something tangible that would make law enforcement take immediate action, especially since I was taking pain medication that might damage my credibility. That's when I remembered my phone's camera and began formulating a plan that would either save those people or get me killed. The following evening, at around 11 p.m., I set up shop in the stairwell with a clear view of the parking lot and the second floor entrance. To white, windowless vans that shouted commercial use pulled up, and 6 men, at least 8 women, and 2 adolescent boys stepped out. They hurried the group in the direction of the building, but I was still able to snap a few good pictures of faces and car plates. More significantly, I captured Elena in the picture as she unlocked the door to room 237, looking utterly terrified. One of the men placed a hand on her shoulder, obviously intended as a warning rather than a consolation. I watched through the screen of my phone as she recoiled from his touch, and the man grinned in a way that made my stomach turn, told me all I needed to know about Eleanor's predicament. The last piece came together the following morning when I heard Pete talking on the phone in the office. I had gone down to complain about a leaking faucet, but I stopped outside his door when I heard him speaking Spanish. His tone was professional. She discussed the shipment and Thursday pickup, mentioning a figure of $50,000 and something about the cleaning girl knowing too much. I made the decision that likely saved many lives, including mine, when I called my ex-partner Jake in Dallas, the one person I fully trusted to handle this without giving away the situation. Pete was not just the motel owner, he was running the entire operation. Elena was in immediate danger, and so was I. If they suspected I had figured out what was happening, my blood ran cold at that realization. The plan was straightforward. I would act normally while they positioned teams around the motel. The next scheduled pickup was Thursday night, just 2 days away, and Jake instructed me to stay in my room. Within 2 hours, he had coordinated with the Texas Rangers and the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. I sent him all of my recordings and photos, along with thorough notes regarding the timing of arrivals and departures. On Wednesday afternoon, I discovered Elena cleaning the laundry room by herself. I cautiously approached her, speaking in the composed tone I'd used with terrified witnesses for 30 years. Elena was the key to everything, and if Pete suspected she had spoken, she would vanish long before any rescue effort could save her. Her eyes widened in fear, and she began shaking her head wildly. "No, you don't understand," she whispered. "They kill people who talk. What's happening in room 237? I said quietly, "I'm a retired police officer. Help is coming tomorrow night, but you need to stay safe until then." Then she told me the whole truth. She wasn't just being coerced into helping. She was being held as collateral for her younger sister, who was somewhere in the trafficking network. If Elena didn't cooperate, her sister would be killed. The operation was perfectly covered by a thunderstorm that arrived Thursday night, and I watched from my window as unmarked cars parked around the motel at 10:47 p.m. Federal agents moved in from all directions as the white vans arrived on time. But this time there were more victims, at least 12 people, including several who appeared to be teenagers, and they were herded toward the building. The coordination was perfect, and they surrounded the vehicles before anyone could flee and secured the building. The investigation found that the Lonia Motor Lodge had been a way station in a trafficking route, that Elena collapsed in the parking lot when she realized it was over, sobbing with relief as a female agent wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Within minutes, I saw Pete being led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence even if they read him his rights. The traffickers attempted to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Stretched from Mexico to major cities in the southern United States, that night more than 40 victims were saved, and in subsequent operations, Elena's sister was discovered alive and reunited with her family in Houston. Pete had been in charge of the operation for 3 years, using the motel's location on a major highway and his connections with dishonest officials in 2 counties. As for me, I finally realized why I'd ended up at that specific motel at that specific time. Prosecutions that followed sent 15 people to federal prison, including Pete, who was given life without parole. Elena testified as a protected witness and was granted asylum before attending nursing school with assistance from a victim services organization. I work as a pediatric nurse at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and last August I had to attend a conference in Cleveland about new trauma protocols. Being 35 and always single, I've gotten pretty comfortable traveling alone for work-related purposes, so the hospital booked me for one of those mid-tier chain hotels. Retirement doesn't always mean leaving your job. Sometimes it means that it finds you when people need you most. The room was on the 4th floor corner unit, which I actually liked because it felt more private, downtown. It was simple but clean, and reasonably priced. You know, the kind of yellow carpets, generic artwork, and that strange smell that's part industrial cleaner and part something you can quite identify. I'd stayed in dozens of places just like it over the years. I was looking forward to just crashing in my room every night with room service and Netflix, because the conference was intense. 3 straight days of lectures about pediatric emergency procedures, but it was quiet compared to my usual spots near the airport. On Wednesday, the first night, I noticed the bathroom vent making this strange rattling sound whenever the air conditioning kicked on. It wasn't loud enough to be really annoying. Just this was tired from traveling on the first day of presentations, so I just turned up the TV volume and tried to ignore the sporadic metallic vibration that would start and stop. I assumed it was loose screws, or perhaps the vent cover wasn't secured properly. However, as I lay in bed that night, I continued to hear this sporadic rattling that didn't seem to have any pattern. I once got up at midnight to look at the vent, but it appeared to be normal from where I was standing, just a regular white metal grate with those horizontal slats, and nothing seemed obviously wrong with it. On Thursday morning, I brought it up to housekeeping when they came to clean the room. I believe the woman's name was when I returned from the conference that evening. Nothing had been fixed, if anything, and the rattling seemed worse. That's when I noticed something else, these tiny flickers of red light coming from the vent area. Carmen was really sorry and said maintenance would take a look. She even wrote it down on her little notepad, which gave me the impression that she was actually going to follow through. Hotels have a variety of safety equipment that visitors don't typically notice. I remember standing in the bathroom brushing my teeth and catching another one of those red flickers in my peripheral vision. I convinced myself that it was probably just the fire alarm sensor or perhaps some sort of motion detector when I caught a reflection off someone's phone screen. Across the room, everything seemed fine right at the vent, but on Thursday night, the rattling became much worse. It wasn't only when the air conditioner ran anymore. It was happening at random, sometimes 4 minutes at a time. At around 11 p.m., I called the front desk. I asked him about the red lights, and he paused for a moment before saying that maintenance would be there first thing in the morning. The night manager, Tony, who had a thick Cleveland accent, apologized profusely and offered to move me to another room, but I had all of my conference materials spread out, my clothes unpacked, and I was really too exhausted to pack everything up again. However, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed that the flickers were happening more frequently and that they seemed to be coming specifically from behind the vent grate, not from any visible detector or alarm. I stood there for probably 5 minutes just to confirm that it was probably just the emergency lighting system doing its routine checks. That made sense to me. I was actually relieved that Friday was the last day of the conference, because I had barely slept Thursday night and would jolt awake every time that rattling started up. However, it was during my morning shower that things took a turn that made my stomach clench with genuine unease. I was shampooing my hair with my eyes closed when I looked up at the vent and rinsed the shampoo out as quickly as I could after hearing what sounded like a soft mechanical whirring coming directly above me. It was different from the usual HVAC noise, more deliberate, like a tiny motor adjusting or focusing. The red light flickered twice before going dark, and I stood there dripping wet, staring at those metal slats, and for the first time something almost responsive about the timing made me wonder if this wasn't just bad wiring or building maintenance issues. Whatever was causing the light knew I was looking, and I spent most of Friday thinking about that vent during the conference sessions. During lunch, I called my sister Katie in Cincinnati and told her about the strange hotel room she's always been in. When I explained the whirring sound and how the light seemed to respond to my movements, the practical member of our family, who works in IT security, started asking technical questions right away. "Are you sure it's not just a smoke detector?" she asked. "Those things can malfunction and flash at weird intervals." Laura became quiet and said, That doesn't. The afternoon sessions went on forever, and I kept checking my phone to see how many hours it would be until I could return to my room and figure out what was going on. "Sounds like any building system I know. Have you actually looked closely at that vent, like really examined it?" I asked her. I dragged one of the desk chairs into the bathroom around 6 p.m. because I was determined to finally solve this mystery. I climbed up to get a better look at the vent, and when I did, I discovered that some of the screws holding the grate in place were a little loose, which explained the rattling. There, perhaps 6 inches back from the grate, barely visible in the shadows, was a small circular object with what appeared to be a lens, angled downward and pointed directly at the shower area. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was looking at something that made every muscle in my body tense as I examined the metal slats and tried to peer through them into the ductwork beyond. I thought I was seeing things, but when I looked again, I saw that it was there. There was a tiny camera, about the size of a quarter, with a small red LED that pulsed once as I stared at it, as if to acknowledge that I had finally found it. I climbed out of the chair so quickly that I almost fell. My heart was racing as I reached for my phone and began taking pictures of the vent from every possible angle. You could just make out that round shape behind the slats in a few of the shots, but they were too dark to show much detail. I called the front desk right away, and when Tony answered, I was barely able to speak. "There's a camera in my bathroom vent," I said, pointing to the shower. There was a long pause before he said, "Ma'am, that's." I informed him that I was standing there observing everything, and he promised to send security and the maintenance supervisor up right away. While I waited, I snapped additional pictures and even attempted to capture a video. "That's a very serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain?" Security arrived in 10 minutes, but the lighting made it nearly impossible to get clear pictures of what I was seeing. 2 men in their 50s, in generic blue uniforms that you see at every hotel chain, were there, and the maintenance supervisor, an older black man named Curtis, carried a toolbox and appeared genuinely concerned. I showed them the pictures on my phone first. Calling attention to Curtis squinted at the screen and grimly nodded. "Yeah, that definitely doesn't belong there," he said. "Let me get this grade off, and we'll see what we're dealing with." He climbed up on the chair I had used earlier and began unscrewing the vent cover. The reason for the rattling I had been hearing for 3 days was explained right away, and when he pulled the grate away, we could all clearly see it. "This is way above my pay grade," Curtis said, wiping his hands on his work shirt. "We need to call the police right now," he said. A small digital camera, mounted on an adjustable bracket with what appeared to be a wireless transmitter attached, was attached. The red LED blinked once, as if it knew it had been discovered. Curtis reached in and carefully disconnected it, handing the device down to one of the security guards. Within minutes, my room was crowded with guests, hotel management, additional security, and finally to Cleveland police officers who appeared to have witnessed such incidents before. One of the security guards was already on his radio, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone at the front desk. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, named Detective Patricia Woods, took command of the scene right once. She took pictures of everything, bagged the camera as proof, and began questioning me in depth about when I had first noticed the issues. "How long have you been staying here?" When I told her this, she inquired. "We've had 3 other complaints about this hotel in the last 8 months. Detective Woods asked Curtis to show them exactly how someone would access the space behind that vent. He led us out of my room and down the hallway to a supply closet that I'd passed dozens of times without giving it a second thought. On my 3rd night, she exchanged a meaningful look with her partner. "You're not the first person to report this," she said quietly. Curtis had to move a number of boxes to gain access to a narrow panel that appeared to be a part of the wall behind. Shelves filled with cleaning supplies and toilet paper. When he used a screwdriver to pry it open, we saw a small crawl space that ran horizontally behind the bathroom walls. "Someone small could definitely fit through here," Detective Woods said, shining her flashlight into the opening. Curtis said, "Jesus Christ," as the laser lit what appeared to be a system of cables and further tiny devices set on brackets. "How long has this been going on already?" The detective's partner was requesting more units and what appeared to be a crime scene team. The hotel manager, Patricia, who had arrived during the chaos, apologized repeatedly and insisted that this was the first time they had heard of any issues. However, Detective Woods wasn't buying it. "Ma'am, we have documented reports going back 8 months, she said firmly. "Suspicious activity involving bathroom vents has been reported by guests in rooms 412, 438, and 441. I felt sick. The detective asked me to pack my things right away when I realized I would be staying in room 447, which was just down the hall from the others. He explained that my room was now a part of an ongoing crime scene. As I packed my clothes into my suitcase, I couldn't help but think of all the times I'd taken a shower, changed, or simply strolled around the room in my underwear over the previous 3 days." Detective Woods explained that the police found cameras in 7 separate rooms on the 4th floor, all accessed through that same crawlspace network. The violation felt overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I had traveled alone 4 years without ever feeling unsafe, and now I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel comfortable in a hotel room again. "This is sophisticated stuff," she told me as I sat in the lobby making my statement about professional-grade equipment with wireless transmission and remote access capabilities. The person who set this up had been planning it for months, if not longer. The cables led to a central recording hub that was concealed in an unused maintenance area between floors. We're looking into current and former employees, contractors, and anyone who would have had regular access to the building's infrastructure. But honestly, this could have been happening. The most unsettling aspect was that the hotel's own security cameras had been tampered with specific angles blocked or redirected to hide whoever was accessing that supply closet. Detective Woods shook her head when I asked if they had any suspects. Detective Woods gave me her card and promised to keep me informed on the investigation. But cases like this are rarely handled. For more than a year, nobody noticed. The hotel moved me to a different property across town for my last night, but I barely slept. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious, and I kept getting up to check the bathroom vents. The equipment we found could store weeks of material, but we don't know if it was being transmitted elsewhere or sold. The legal implications were also unclear. Apparently, privacy laws vary greatly depending on whether recordings were made, stored, or distributed. She had warned me that even if we were to identify who did this, it would be difficult to prove that they actually recorded or distributed footage. Katie was incensed and wanted me to call a lawyer right away after I told her everything, but I really just wanted to go home and try to process what had happened. The follow-up investigation took months, and Detective Woods called me twice in September to give me an update on their progress. They had spoken with dozens of hotel staff members, both past and present, but no one was speaking, and the equipment had been destroyed. We're treating this as an organized operation, she told me during our most recent conversation. It's not some lone pervert with a hidden camera. The level of planning and technical expertise suggests multiple people were involved. The wireless signals led to dead ends and were likely routed through multiple networks to conceal their origin. In November, I received a letter from the hotel's corporate office offering a settlement. In the end, my lawyer Katie persuaded me to hire one for any inconvenience or distress I might have had, and she advised me to accept it rather than pursue a drawn-out lawsuit with uncertain outcomes. The amount was significant enough to feel like an admission of wrongdoing, even though the hotel never acknowledged fault. As of right now, no arrests have been made in my case. I've completely changed the way I travel. I always ask for rooms on the second floor now, and I thoroughly check every bathroom vent, smoke detector, and electrical outlet before unpacking. I also carry a small flashlight specifically for checking dark corners and crevices. Detective Woods retired last spring, and the new detective assigned to the file seems less interested in pursuing it. Most of my co-workers believe I'm paranoid. I don't care, though, because the fact that someone was watching me take a shower, sleep, and move around that room still bothers me at random times. I sometimes wonder how many other hotels have similar arrangements, and how many other tourists have had the same unsettling feeling that I wrote off 4 nights as simply malfunctioning equipment. The Cleveland Police Department still has an open case file somewhere, but I'm not waiting for a resolution. At least I. Please understand that I'm not insane, and that the rattling vent was trying to tell me something significant all along. I was 28 years old and traveling cross-country for a new job in Portland. I had been traveling for 3 days in a row when I finally felt tired somewhere in rural Virginia. It was late March 2019, and I had been working hard to make good time while surviving on gas, station coffee, and determination. The independent motel I stumbled into at midnight was not much to look at. The neon sign that read Pine Valley Inn was flickering, half of the letters dark, and the old clerk behind the bulletproof glass had deep-set eyes that seemed to follow me as I filled out the registration card with his weathered hand. The blue paint was faded and peeling off the wooden siding. The building seemed to have been frozen in time since the 1970s, complete with wood-paneled walls that seemed to absorb what little light the dim hallway fixtures provided, and orange shag carpet that squirted slightly under my boots. He had said, "Room 237, second floor," as he slowly and deliberately slid the room key through the slot. The key, a real metal key rather than a card, turned with a grinding sound that reverberated through the empty hallway. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial disinfectant, and the mismatched furniture, which appeared to have been collected from different decades, sagged in the middle of the hallway, past a vending machine that hummed menacingly and cast strange shadows. Through its cracked glass front, I had intended to take a shower and crash right away, but something about the quiet felt oppressive, not the cozy quiet of an empty building, but the kind that makes you strain your ears waiting for sounds that shouldn't be there. The center was covered by a floral comforter that had seen better days, and the single window looked out onto the parking lot where my Honda sat alone under a streetlight that buzzed and flickered intermittently. The walls were thin. I tried the television, but only 2 channels came in, obviously a late-night infomercial and static-filled local news. The shower head sputtered rusty water for the first few minutes. I could hear every car passing on the interstate about a quarter of a mile away, their headlights occasionally sweeping across my window as they took the curve near the motel. By the time I eventually got into bed at 1:30 a.m., I was regretting not pushing through to the next town's sleep, because the bathroom mirror had a crack diagonally across it that divided my reflection into 2 misaligned pieces, and it was only seconds before flowing clear, came intermittently interrupted by the distant sound of a train horn or the rumble of a truck engine. The heating unit beneath the window cycled on and off with mechanical groans that sounded louder in the dark. and the mattress springs creaked with every movement. I would fall asleep for what seemed like minutes before being roused by a small sound, such as the building's settling pipes clicking in the walls or the wind rattling the loose window frame. Was lying there at about 4:45 a.m., counting the water stains on the ceiling and attempting to form them into clouds, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and stopped every few feet, as though someone was listening at each door. The footsteps were accompanied by other footsteps stopped right outside my door, and I held my breath as every muscle in my body tensed, as I listened to what sounded like someone very gently trying the door handle. The metal gave the faintest squeak as it turned just barely, as if whoever was out there was testing whether it would give way. It was a faint metallic sound, like keys jingling softly, or perhaps a door handle being tested. My heart began pounding my ribs when I realized that I couldn't recall if I had used the regular lock or the deadbolt. The handle turned more slowly this time, and I heard the mechanism's gentle click engage, followed by what sounded like someone lightly pushing against the door. Thank God I had thrown the security chain, a thin object that most likely wouldn't deter a determined individual, but at least it was something. The pushing ceased, and for a few long seconds, there was total silence, as though whoever was outside was debating what to do next. Then, like fingernails dragging across painted wood, there was a gentle scratching sound at the door that made my skin crawl. It began close to the handle and moved slowly and deliberately upward. I wanted to look through the small circle of glass where the peephole would be, but something instinctive in my brain told me that it would be a mistake. Instead, I lay motionless, barely breathing, while the scratching went on for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. When it stopped, I heard those same measured footsteps left my door and continued down the hallway toward the other rooms. They stopped again at what I assumed was the next door down, and I heard the same soft handle testing followed by that terrible scratching sound. I couldn't take it any longer, so I slipped out of bed as stealthily as I could and slithered toward the street light continued its unpredictable flickering, casting everything in sporadic pools of yellow light and deep shadow. I pressed my face against the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there when they eventually left the building. The parking lot was empty except for my car and an old pickup truck I hadn't noticed before, rusted white with Mississippi plates and what appeared to be camping gear in the back. I tried to see the motel's entrance through the glass, but the angle was off. When 3:30 a.m. arrived, all I could do was listen to the footsteps as they carefully tested each door one by one down the hall. Some doors only got a quick handle check, while others got the full treatment, which included turning, pushing, and that awful scratching sound that seemed to go on forever. The hallway was quiet once more, but I couldn't bring myself to go back to sleep. Instead, I waited for dawn in the room's lone chair, which was positioned so I could see the window and the door. Every little sound made me jump, including the sound of a car door slamming in the distance or the ice machine kicking on. Around 4 a.m., I heard what sounded like a door opening and closing somewhere in the building, followed by the distant sound of an engine starting up. I looked out the window and saw the white pickup truck leaving the parking lot, its headlights sweeping across the building. The digital clock's display was changing with its soft electronic beep. The driver kept the interior light off before vanishing onto the access road, so I was unable to see any details, but the truck's slow, almost grudging motion gave the impression that the driver was not in a rush to get out. At around 6 in the morning, the sun finally began to peek over the horizon. The typical morning sounds, such as birds chirping, distant traffic picking up on the interstate, and somewhere in the building the rumble of old pipes as someone turned on a shower, made me feel as though I had been holding my breath for hours. I was able to sleep fitfully for about an hour before giving up completely and choosing to check. The hallway appeared smaller and less shabby than I had remembered in the morning, and the orange carpet was even more gaudy in the morning light, stained from decades of spills and foot traffic. I packed quickly, cramming everything into my duffel bag without bothering to fold anything properly, because I was nervous and the idea of spending another night here made my stomach turn. When I went to check out, I noticed that a number of the room doors had deep scratches around the handles, as if they had been forced open several times over the years. The same old clerk was still behind the desk, but he appeared to have been there the entire night. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a coffee cup with a film covering it next to his elbow, which suggested it had been there 4 hours. "Shouldn't have been nobody on your floor," he said at the end, his voice even more gruff than it had been the previous night. "You were the only guest up there. Got a businessman in 1014 and a trucker in 115, but second floor was empty except for you." His expression didn't change at all when he heard someone in the hallway during the night. He just stared at me with those deep-set eyes, as if I was speaking a foreign language. He said it with such certainty that I almost doubted what I'd experienced, but I knew what I'd heard. I pressed him for more information explaining about the footsteps and the door handle testing, but he just shrugged and said old buildings produce odd noises. When I asked him about the white pickup truck, his face went completely blank, and he became very interested in rummaging through some papers on his desk. "Could have been the wind," he suggested, even though I couldn't recall any wind or perhaps pipe settling happens frequently. However, something in his eyes told me he knew more than he was letting on. I paid my bill in cash only, of course, and made my way to the door, eager to put some distance between myself and the Pine Valley Inn. However, as I was packing my bag into the Honda, I heard raised voices coming from around the side of the building. "Know nothing about no pickup truck," he muttered, not looking up. "We get all kinds of vehicles through here. The better of me," and I approached the sound while remaining near the building's wall. What I saw in front of room 115, the same room the clerk had mentioned housing a trucker, made my legs weak. One of the officers was talking into his radio, and the other was taking pictures inside the doorway. From my vantage point, I couldn't see much, but I did catch a glimpse of someone being loaded onto a stretcher alive. Fortunately, the person was obviously unconscious. They looked to be middle-aged and were wearing a flannel shirt. Their motions were controlled but urgent, and there was something about how still they were lying that suggested whatever had happened wasn't just someone dozing off after drinking too much. An EMT was checking vital signs, while another prepared an IV bag. The clerk had come out of the office, looking more animated than I had seen him all morning, and from what I could hear, housekeeping had found the trucker around 7 a.m. One of the officers, a tall woman with greying hair pulled back in a tight bun, was interviewing him. Despite my knowledge that I should leave, something held me in place as I watched the scene play out. The clerk's responses were brief and evasive, but when she inquired about the second floor, I heard him state unequivocally, "Had one guest up there, young fella driving cross-country, checked out about an hour ago. I was unconscious on his floor, with his door wide open, and the officer kept asking about other guest security cameras and whether anyone had reported suspicious activity." I approached the officers and told them what I had seen during the night, including the footsteps, the door testing, the scratching noises, and the white pickup truck departing at around 4 a.m., even though my gut told me to get in my car and leave as soon as possible. That's when I realized I needed to talk to them. When I explained how someone had carefully gone down the hallway testing each door, the female officer, whose nameplate read Sergeant Collins, listened carefully and took thorough notes. Her expression darkened. The victim's door wasn't forced. She informed me that only the handle was engaged and not the lock. They had been following a string of similar incidents along the interstate, always at small independent motels that targeted lone travelers in unlocked rooms. The EMTs loaded the trucker into their ambulance. She asked me to describe the pickup truck in detail, and when I mentioned the Mississippi plates and camping gear, she exchanged a meaningful look with her partner, and one of them informed me that the victim would likely be okay. It seemed like the victim had been drugged rather than physically attacked, but they wouldn't be certain until blood tests were completed. Lucky you used your deadbolt, Sergeant Collins said, passing me her card. We think this guy has been working this stretch of highway 4 months, maybe longer. He always hits places without security cameras. She clarified that they had discovered evidence in previous cases that the offender carried a seditious substance, most likely one that could be inhaled or applied through skin contact. The scratching I had heard at my door could have been him, attempting to get something through the opening or checking to see if the door frame was loose enough to be manipulated from the outside. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Sergeant Collins. They had apprehended Bobby Hutchins, a drifter who had been residing in that white pickup truck and targeting remote motels along I-95. He had admitted to more than a dozen similar break-ins, always searching for unlocked doors and lone travelers who wouldn't be noticed right away. The scratching sound I had heard was him testing door frames with a thin metal tool, handle interior locks. In my instance, the security chain rescued me because he was unable to get past it without creating a noise that could disturb other visitors. Around 3 in the morning, the trucker in room 115 left his door unlocked while going outside for a cigarette. I'm giving Hutchins the chance he's been anticipating. Some places just give you the creeps, and the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Chicago was one of those places. However, after working the night shift there for 3 years, I thought I'd seen everything, but I was completely wrong. I still think about that night occasionally, especially when I'm staying somewhere I've never been before. I always use the deadbolt now, double-check the security chain, and never leave my door unlocked, not even for a minute. The entire nightmare began in February 2021, during one of those harsh Chicago winters when the wind howls through the streets like something alive and angry. I was 26 years old at the time, just out of college with a degree in hospitality, and I need to tell someone about what happened with room 712 because keeping it to myself is making me crazy. The Grand Meridian wasn't the Ritz, but it was respectable enough. It had 12 floors of fading elegance that tried to compete with the sexier spots downtown. Most nights were fairly routine, with drunk businessmen stumbling through the lobby, the odd domestic argument, and maybe a noise complaint here and there. But room 712 was unique from the beginning, and I ought to have noticed the pattern earlier. The initial complaint was made at 2 a.m. on a Monday. Mrs. Henderson, an old woman who had been staying with us for a week while her apartment was being fumigated, called down to the front desk at 7:14. Her voice was unsteady and agitated about everything. She was the kind of person who would complain if her towels weren't folded perfectly, but that night she sounded really upset. There was a dispute going on next door, and she whispered into the phone as if she was worried someone might hear her. I could hear a man and woman yelling at each other through the vents, and the woman sounded terrified. I checked our system and discovered that room 712 was occupied by a Thomas Wright, a businessman, arrived alone for a 3-day conference. There was no mention of a companion, so I told Mrs. Henderson that I would send security up to investigate. I sent Jimmy, our night security guard, who had been there since the hotel opened, to check it out. Jimmy returned 20 minutes later, looking completely bewildered. He knocked on 712, got no response, and used his master key to peek inside the room. Thomas Wright was nowhere to be seen, but his luggage was still there, his wallet was on the nightstand, and his laptop was plugged in and charging. Jimmy checked the front cameras and verified that Wright had arrived at the hotel at around 6 p.m. but never left. The strangest thing was that Jimmy claimed he could hear muffled voices coming from the walls while he was in the room, but he was unable to identify their source. When he put his ear to the air vent, the sound abruptly stopped. We recorded the incident, assuming that Wright might have gone outside for a smoke or something and would return an hour later. The second incident occurred precisely 1 week later at 7:14 and involved a different guest, a young couple from Denver named the Johnsons, who were in town for their anniversary at around 3 a.m. claiming that the argument had stopped, so we all assumed that whatever it was had resolved itself. However, Wright never returned to his room that night. They both called down in a panic, shouting over each other about hearing domestic violence coming from 712. David, the husband, was furious and insisted that we call the police because he claimed to have heard a woman sobbing and pleading with someone to stop hitting her. His wife also insisted that she heard glass breaking and furniture being thrown around. According to our records, room 712 should have been empty that night, but either room was completely empty, there were no signs of any disturbances, and everything was neat and tidy. However, Jimmy mentioned something that made my skin crawl. He claimed that when he stood in the middle of the room, he could swear he heard faint sobbing coming from inside the walls, as if someone was trapped in the ventilation system. Became unavoidable after that. Every week, whoever had been staying in room 714 would call down with the same complaint: violent arguments, cries, and sounds of someone being hurt. Each time we looked into it, the room was either empty or the visitor had no idea what we were talking about. There were often noises coming from the vents between 2 and 4 in the morning, and they always ceased as soon as security arrived at 712. What really started to worry me was the specificity of the allegations. Visitors would talk about hearing a woman beg, "Please don't, I'll be fine. I swear." One visitor even said she heard someone being dragged across the floor, or heard a man's voice yelling, "You made me do this." The descriptions were so clear and consistent that I began keeping a Melissa Torres, a marketing executive from Phoenix, checked into 714 for a 4-night business trip. She called down on her second night with the typical complaint, but this time she was completely unaccounted for. By May, I had recorded 12 distinct incidents, all of which followed the same pattern. The woman next door was asking for help, and I could hear her sobbing through the telephone as she screamed into the phone. I can hear her choking, gasping for air. "You have to do something." She was distraught, saying that someone was being murdered in there. Jimmy hurried up there right away, but room 712 was occupied by Harold Brennan, an elderly man who was sound asleep and utterly confused when Jimmy woke him up. Brennan insisted he hadn't heard anything strange and had been sleeping peacefully 4 hours. Melissa insisted on being moved to a different room, so we moved her to the 5th floor. She appeared calmer after that. Even the problem is that when housekeeping went to clean at 7:14 the following day, Melissa was gone. Her bed had been made, and her belongings were packed and waiting by the door, but we looked everywhere. Her car was still in our parking garage, and the front desk cameras showed that her credit card hadn't been used since dinner the previous evening. The most unsettling aspect was that her room key card showed no activity when she entered the elevator at approximately 11 p.m., indicating that she never left room, at least not through the door. The hotel management wanted to keep it quiet, so they waited 3 days before reporting her missing, saying they believed she might have gone with a friend or co-worker. The police investigation was exhaustive, but it found nothing. Melissa Torres had just disappeared, as if she had never been there. Her employer finally sent someone to pick her up. Things returned to normal at the hotel, but I couldn't stop thinking about her terrified voice on the phone pleading with us to help the woman in room 712, a woman who, based on our records and security checks, didn't exist. That's when I made the decision to learn more about the history of room 712. I'd worked at the Grand Meridian for 3 years, but I'd never bothered to look into the hotel's past beyond the basic information is provided during orientation. The building was built in 1967, had undergone multiple renovations, and had undergone ownership changes. However, given what guests were hearing through those vents, I thought there must be more to it. I began by asking some of the older staff members, housekeepers, and maintenance personnel who had worked there for decades. Most of them simply shrugged or gave me strange looks when I referred to room 712. But one afternoon, Dolores from housekeeping finally pulled me aside. She was a tough, 60-year-old Puerto Rican woman who had been cleaning rooms since the 1980s, and she had this expression in her eyes that said she had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. "That room has history, Miho," she whispered, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "It was bad history that management doesn't want." Nobody mentioned it, but Dolores told me about a murder that occurred in room 712 in 1989. Catherine Walsh and her boyfriend, a wealthy suburban lawyer known for being violent and domineering, were staying there, and according to Dolores, the entire 7th floor heard them fighting that night and screaming and throwing objects. Richard Cromwell, Catherine's boyfriend, claimed it was an accident, saying she had slipped and fallen during an argument. However, his story kept changing, first claiming she hit her head on the sink, then claiming she tripped over the bathroom rug, and finally claiming that when hotel security finally intervened, they discovered Catherine dead in the bathroom, head smashed in with a crystal ashtray. Catherine's death was declared accidental, and Cromwell left without even a slap on the wrist. The hotel management paid off her family to remain silent about it, and the police investigation was a farce. Because Cromwell had connections throughout the city, his father was a powerful judge and had friends in the prosecutor's office. What really got to me, though, was Dolores' statement that room 712 had been problematic ever since Catherine's death. It wasn't just the typical hotel oddities, it was something more sinister. Guests would complain about hearing arguments and crying through the vents, which is exactly what I'd been recording. Other times, they would find the bathroom flooded without any explanation or find that all the towels had been thrown. One visitor reported seeing a woman's reflection in the bathroom mirror standing behind her, despite the fact that housekeeping had just cleaned the space. However, when she turned around, no one was there. Another visitor woke up to discover all of the furniture pressed against the door, as if someone had been attempting to barricade themselves inside. The hotel tried everything, including calling in priests to bless the space, psychics visited the room, and the entire space was renovated 3 times, but nothing changed. The incidents would pause for a few months before reoccurring. Eventually, management began to avoid scheduling 712 unless absolutely necessary, and they never placed anyone in 714 if they could avoid it, because that's where the complaints always came from. After speaking with Dolores, I knew I had to see the temperature dropped about 10 as soon as we entered the room. This is common for old hotels with faulty HVAC systems, but I had never really paid attention to the details until one night when 7112 was empty. I grabbed Jimmy and told him I needed to check the room for maintenance issues. It was different. It felt like entering a freezer. The room appeared to be a typical hotel room, with old furniture and a generic beige color scheme that shouts trying too hard to be inoffensive. However, as soon as I entered the bathroom, my entire body began to tingle, as if the air were charged with static. Jimmy was getting restless and kept checking his watch, asking if we could hurry up. That's when we both heard a soft whimpering sound coming from inside the walls, like someone crying very quietly. The bathroom had been completely renovated since 1989, but I could still see dark stains around the base of the toilet that suspiciously looked like old bloodstains that hadn't been cleaned. That experience changed everything for me. I couldn't ignore what was happening any longer, so I started looking up information about Catherine Walsh online. We looked at each other for maybe 30 seconds before stopping completely. Jimmy said, "Nope, we're done here," and practically ran out of the room. I discovered police reports and old newspaper archives through a friend who worked at the Chicago Tribune. The more I learned about her, the more irate I became. Catherine was only 24 years old when she passed away. She was a kindergarten teacher who had relocated to Chicago to start over after a difficult breakup. She met Richard Cromwell at a charity event, and her friends said he initially came across as charming, successful, and well-connected. guy who could provide her with a nice life, but the relationship quickly became toxic. Years later, her sister said in an interview that Catherine had called her the week before she passed away, crying and wanting to leave Cromwell, but being afraid of what he might do. She had previously attempted to end their relationship twice, and both times he had threatened to destroy her family and career. The night she died, witnesses the coroner's report noted defensive wounds on Catherine Walsh's hands and arms, but for some reason that detail was missed during the investigation. Catherine Walsh died alone and terrified, and the man who killed her was never brought to justice. I made a decision that may sound crazy, but I felt like I owed it to Catherine. I saw them fighting in the hotel lobby and in the elevator. Cromwell gripped her arm so tightly that it left bruises. I know how that sounds, but when I was by myself in 712, telling her story aloud and acknowledging what had happened to her, the room felt warmer and less oppressive. I also did something that might have led to my termination. I began warning visitors assigned to 7A14 not directly, as that would have raised concerns with management, but subtly suggesting they might perhaps mention that the 7th floor might be noisy due to VUC problems. Most people didn't mind, but a few took the hint and asked for different rooms. After that, the number of complaints from 714 drastically decreased, and the few times we did receive calls, I made sure to answer promptly and treat the guests with respect. I also persuaded Jimmy to perform more thorough checks of 712 than just quick ones. When Richard Cromwell arrived at the hotel in August, I instantly recognized him from the old newspaper photos. He was wearing an expensive suit, his hair was graying, and he still had that smug look. Peeks, but actual searches to make sure no one was hiding in there or using it for illegal activities. We never found anything, but I think our increased presence helped somehow. He felt he was untouchable and wanted to reserve room 712 in particular. He claimed to have sentimental reasons for staying there, which made me cringe, but I couldn't exactly turn him down without giving an explanation, so I put him in room 7 at 12 and made sure to be in a position where I could keep a close eye on things that night as around 2 a.m. When we awoke, smoke was streaming out from beneath the door of 712. The sprinkler system had gone off, and the entire hallway was filled with the smell of something burning. We discovered Cromwell unconscious on the bathroom floor, having inhaled smoke and had a gash on his forehead where he had apparently struck the sink. The strange part was that there was no fire source, no electrical problems, no burned furniture, and nothing that could have produced smoke. The room was soaked from the sprinklers, but there was no real fire damage anywhere. Cromwell spent 3 days in the hospital, and when he left, he checked out right away without speaking to anyone. Management dismissed it as a sprinkler system malfunction, but I knew better than to blame Catherine. I've been unsure whether to share this 4 months, but what happened to my girlfriend Emily and me at the Riverside in last September still bothers me. At the time, we were both 24 years old, fresh out of college, and had enough money saved up for a nice weekend trip. I was working at a tech startup. We'd been together for 3 years and, to be honest, we really needed this break. The stress of our new jobs was wearing us down. So we thought a peaceful weekend at this ostensibly charming historic hotel would be ideal. Emily was teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school across town, and downtown was pulling those typical 60-hour weeks. When we arrived that Friday afternoon in late September, the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn, and the hotel looked just like the pictures. It was a stunning old brick building with ivy crawling up the walls. We specifically requested a room on the 2nd floor, number 237, away from the elevators and main hallways, because we wanted total silence. When I mentioned that we had specifically requested a quiet room, the desk clerk, Warren, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a nervous manner, seemed strangely insistent about our room assignment. The tall windows and walls seemed to watch you as you approached the entrance. The check-in process was fairly standard, though. He handed over the antique brass keys with a strange emphasis, as if he was relieved to be getting rid of them, and Emily and I simply shrug it off. Hotel employees can be strange, especially in older establishments. The lobby smelled like old buildings, mixed with furniture polish and something else I couldn't quite place. We picked up our bags and made our way up the narrow staircase, the old wooden steps creaking under our feet in this rhythmic pattern that would later become sickeningly familiar. There were a dozen other guests strewn about, reading newspapers or talking quietly, but there was something off about the place that made even ordinary conversation seem muffled. Room 237 was at the end of a long hallway lined with faded. Emily quickly went to open the door after we entered what appeared to be a perfectly normal hotel room, complete with a queen bed, a burgundy comforter, heavy curtains that blocked most of the natural light, and floral wallpaper and dim sconce lighting that created odd shadows between the door frames. The key turned easily in the old lock. The room had 2 windows facing east, toward what the clerk had called the garden view, but all I could see were overgrown bushes and the parking lot beyond. I was struck by how quiet it was, not the serene kind of quiet we had hoped for, but this oppressive silence that made you want to whisper even when Emily was moving around unpacking her footsteps. I dropped our bags near the dresser after. The curtains were drawn, appeared muted, as if the room was absorbing sound. We initially dismissed this as the result of the old building's strong insulation. We spent the evening visiting the neighboring downtown area, had supper at a small Italian restaurant, and returned at approximately 1000 p.m. the first night. We both slept like rocks, so Emily brought some melatonin because she's always been a light sleeper, and I was exhausted from the work week. Nevertheless, we woke up on Saturday morning feeling rejuvenated and eager to explore. We had breakfast at the hotel's restaurant, which wasn't particularly fancy but adequate, and then spent the day hiking at a nearby state park that Emily loves. I'm ready to crash and enjoy our first full day tomorrow. The day was clear and crisp, one of those ideal autumn days when the air smells of leaves and wood smoke, and she kept stopping to take pictures of the fall foliage and old stone walls along the trails. I remember thinking how wonderful everything was going, and how we'd finally found a place where we could truly disconnect from all the stress back home. We even discussed possibly returning to this area for a longer vacation at some point. We were exhausted, but content when we got back to the hotel that evening at around 8 p.m. and we decided to order room service and watch a movie before going to bed. Warren was still working at the front desk, and he inquired about our day with the same anxious energy, nodding a little too enthusiastically when we mentioned that we had a terrific day, but we were totally unprepared for what was about to begin. It began at 11:30 p.m. Saturday night. We had ordered room service, simply some sandwiches and fries, and with the first bang, which sounded like someone had taken a sledgehammer to the opposite side of the wall, came from the wall behind our headboard halfway through a Netflix movie. Emily and I both jumped, and she instantly grabbed the remote to pause the film. We sat there in total silence, waiting to see if it would happen again. About 30 seconds later, there was another bang, just as loud, followed by "maybe there, moving furniture," Emily whispered. But even as she said it, we both knew that didn't make sense. Who moves furniture at 11:30 at night in a hotel? The banging, Emily said. And then there was silence once more. Emily's expression was one I had never seen before, not quite fear, but concern mixed with confusion. Went on intermittently for roughly 20 minutes, sometimes a single blow, other times 3 or 4 in quick succession, all coming from the same location behind our bed. Each blow was so powerful that our headboard actually vibrated against the wall. By midnight, we'd had enough, and Emily was clearly shaken. Emily has always been sensitive to noise, which is why we'd specifically asked for a quiet room, and I contacted the front desk first, and Warren picked up the phone on the first ring, if he had been waiting. After I mentioned the noise, there was a lengthy silence before he said, "I apologize, sir. I'll check into it right away." He spoke in a strained tone. The banging stopped the instant I hung up the phone, and there was complete silence. We waited for another hour, but Emily finally relaxed enough to try to fall asleep, even though she kept the TV on low for background noise, so I stayed up much longer listening. We didn't even bring it up when we saw Warren at breakfast. He seemed to be back to his usual anxious self, asking about our plans for the day with the same forced enthusiasm. The rest of the night was calm. The following morning, we both convinced ourselves that it had been a one-time thing, possibly maintenance work that had run late. Sunday was another gorgeous day, so we drove to a nearby lake and rented a kayak, because Emily loves being on the water. It's one of her favorite ways to unwind, and we paddled around 4 hours talking about everything but the disturbance from the night before. Emily took probably 50 pictures of the lake, which was surrounded by beautiful hills covered in red and gold maples, and we had lunch at a small diner in town where the waitress knew everyone's name, and the pie was homemade. For a few hours, I forgot about the banging and enjoyed spending time with Emily in this serene environment. We even discussed possibly staying an additional day, because we both had Monday off anyhow. However, as the sun began to set and we made our way back to the hotel, I noticed Emily becoming more tense and quiet. She kept checking her phone and adjusting the radio volume if she were trying to avoid thinking about anything. We had already paid for tonight's, so maybe we should simply drive home tonight, she whispered softly as we pulled into the hotel parking lot at approximately 7:00 p.m. To be honest, I was hoping the previous night had been an anomaly when the banging began, even earlier, at approximately 10:15 p.m. on Sunday, as we were getting ready for bed. It was different this time. It was more forceful and persistent, and instead of hitting intermittently, it was a constant pattern that went bang, 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 pause, then 3 more. The sound was so intense that the pictures on our wall were actually shifting, and I could see dust falling from the ceiling where it met the wall. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, completely rigid, her eyes wide, and she kept saying, "This isn't normal." It continued for 10 minutes without stopping. I picked up my phone and called the front desk again, but this time it rang, and I had never seen Emily so terrified, and that scared me more than the noise itself. The banging continued, and now there was what sounded like scratching or scraping against the wall surface. Emily began to cry, but not so much as these silent tears streaming down her face as she stared at the wall as if something were going to break through it. Eventually, after 15 minutes or so, I reached the front desk. A woman who sounded much older than Warren answered, and I tried to maintain my composure as I explained the situation. The banging continuing in the background. The woman, who identified herself as Mrs. Patterson, the night manager, listened quietly before saying, "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Collins. Unfortunately, where I am fully booked for tonight, thus I am unable to provide you with an alternate room." As another round of blows rattled our headboard, I heard Emily weeping behind me. "Look," I said to my skinny patients, "this is totally unacceptable. We paid for a quiet room. I understand your frustration, sir, but I'm afraid there is nothing I can do about the adjacent room tonight. Maybe tomorrow will be quieter." Mrs. Patterson's response chilled me. It seemed like she was being purposefully evasive when she said, "Adjacent room." I insisted on speaking with the person in charge of the room. The banging abruptly stopped mid-conversation, and I could hear Mrs. Patterson breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "I'll make a note in your file," she finally said, and hung up before I could reply. Emily and I spent the remainder of the night in the lobby, where we gathered our pillows and blankets and set up camp on one of those large leather couches. The night security guard, an older man named Frank, who was sitting on couches near the fireplace, didn't appear shocked to see us there. He simply nodded when I explained the commotion and remarked, "Sometimes the old building settles funny at night." However, there was something in his eyes that Emily nestled up against me, but she hardly slept. Every time the ancient building made even the slightest noise, like a pipe groaning or the elevator buzzing, she would tighten up. I napped fitfully, waking up roughly every hour to check on her. He had given me a knowing smile that suggested he had seen this before. "Lots of history in these old walls," Frank said thoughtfully, as he brought us some coffee and sat with us. For a while, he was talkative and told us stories about the hotel's past, including how it was a boarding house in the 1920s, a family home, and then a hotel in the 1980s. When I asked him directly about noise complaints, he simply shrugged and remarked, "Some rooms are quieter than others." By morning, we were worn out, irritable, and prepared to demand answers. On Monday morning, Warren returned to the front desk and appeared to have not slept either. His glasses were crooked, his hair was unkempt, and Emily and I looked at the room next to ours at 235. "We want to change rooms," I said firmly. "Today, right now." He kept looking toward the staircase, as if he expected something to come down it. When we got to the desk, he started apologizing right away. Before we even said anything, he wrung his hands and said, "I'm so sorry about last night." After a few minutes, Warren looked up with a dejected expression and said, "I'm afraid we're still completely booked. There's a big conference in town, and every hotel in the area is full." Warren's face became white and he began typing quickly on his computer. "Then we want to speak to your manager," Emily said, her voice trembling with rage and fatigue. Warren promised to have someone call us within an hour, so we went to get breakfast determined not to spend any more money. I didn't buy it for a second. The hotel parking lot was maybe half full, and we'd barely seen a dozen other guests during our entire stay. Another night in room 237. But this is where things started to get really strange. At around noon, I made the decision to conduct some independent research. Emily was napping in the lobby, exhausted from the restless night, so I discreetly made my way back to the second floor. I took my time walking down the hallway to room 237, then passed it to where I stood there for a full minute trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the hallway ended at our room with a blank wall where the next door should have been. The room numbers went 233,237. Then nothing. So I went back down the hallway counting doors and double-checking the numbers. There was definitely no room 235, but the banging had obviously come from that direction. I even put my ear to the wall, where the room should be, but I heard nothing, no furniture, no footsteps, just silence. The wallpaper there was also a little different, looking like it had just been replaced. I took pictures with my phone, but I wasn't sure what they would show. When I returned to the lobby, Emily was awake and Mrs. Patterson, a slender woman, in her 60s with steel grey hair pulled back in a tight bun and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through you, was apologizing profusely to Emily and saying that they would do everything in their power to make our stay comfortable. When I walked up to her, she turned to me and smiled practicedly, saying, "Mr. Collins, I understand you've been having some issues with noise from the adjacent room, but I want to assure you that we take these complaints very seriously." I immediately told her about my discovery upstairs, that there was no room 235, that the hallway just ended at a blank wall. Her smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, that's an odd mistake in our system. I've spoken with maintenance," she said, "and they've confirmed that the adjacent space is currently sealed off for asbestos removal," she said in a carefully controlled voice. "Let me check our records." She disappeared into the back office for about 10 minutes while Emily and I waited, both of us growing more nervous by the minute. When she returned, she was carrying a clipboard and wearing that same forced smile. "Been vacant for a number of months." The words hit me like a physical blow. Emily grabbed my arm so hard I could feel her nails through my shirt. "What do you mean empty?" I inquired, "even though I was aware that the space next to your room is under renovation." Mrs. Patterson said slowly, as if she was carefully choosing each word, "There's been no one in there since last spring. The room was damaged in a small Fire, and we're waiting for environmental clearance before we can begin repairs." Emily was staring at her. I didn't want to hear the response, but at last her composure broke a little and I could see sweat beating on her forehead, despite the cool lobby temperature. I said, barely raising my voice above a whisper, "So you're telling us?" With this look of utter horror and the feeling that the floor was tilting under my feet, that all that banging and all that noise for tonight was coming from an empty, sealed room. Mrs. Patterson simply nodded, her eyes not quite meeting ours. "Sometimes old pipes settling. You know, buildings make strange noises," she said weakly, but we all knew that wasn't what this was. The banging had been too purposeful, too rhythmic, and too deliberate. Emily began recording on her phone in the lobby. "I want this on record," she said, her voice trembling, but determined that we weren't crazy or making this up. Emily wasn't having it. "No," she said firmly. "We're checking out right now, and we want a full refund, and we want answers about what's really happening in that room." Mrs. Patterson appeared truly panicked, looking around the lobby to see if other guests were listening. "Please, let's discuss this privately," she said, gesturing toward the back office. "This location." I took out my own phone and began recording, as well, capturing Mrs. Patterson's increasingly desperate attempts to minimize the situation. She insisted that the renovation area was totally secure and that the noises were simply from an old building. He muttered softly to Mrs. Patterson, "Please give them the refund. Anything could be making intentional noises," but her story kept changing. First it was asbestos removal, then fire damage, then general renovations, and finally Warren came out from behind the front desk, looking like he might be ill. "Simply let them go." Frank, the security guard, came over to us as we were packing the car. He looked around anxiously before leaning in and saying, "You people weren't the first to complain about that room, and it won't be the last either." We packed our stuff quickly and left within an hour. When I questioned him about it, he simply shook his head and left. We drove home in largely silence as we both tried to comprehend what had happened. Emily kept checking her phone, listening to the audio recordings she had made of our talk with Mrs. Patterson. As soon as we arrived, she started looking up reviews of the hotel online, searching for any additional mentions of odd noises or the hotel's responses to the at least a dozen reviews she found over the previous 2 years that mentioned unexplained banging, scratching, and other sounds. Nearly all from guests who had stayed in room 237 were consistently the same, apologetic, but evasive, blaming nearby construction or old building sounds. We never received a satisfactory explanation for what happened to us that weekend. Gave us a complete refund within a week, but they never inquired further or offered any concrete explanations regarding the sealed room or the cause of the disruptions. Emily and I are still together, but we will never be able to forget those two nights. Occasionally, when the house is completely silent at night and we are lying in bed, we will hear a faint noise from a pipe settling the refrigerator cycling on and wheel, on and wheel. I ended up at the Riverside Inn during my junior year at State in November 2022, where I was there for a 3-day debate tournament that could make or break my scholarship chances. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, and I was both stressed out remembering that rhythm of deliberate banging that came from a room that didn't exist 20 years old and broke as hell. Behind the front desk was a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too big for his face. His name tag read Norman, and he had the nervous habit of tapping his pen against the counter in quick bursts of 3. When I asked about the Wi-Fi, he responded with peeling wallpaper in the lobby carpet that squished under your feet like it was permanently damp. He simply gazed at me for 10 full seconds before writing the password on a piece of paper. His handwriting appeared like chicken scratching, and Riverside 123 was only visible when I squinted. It seemed as though he was functioning on a separate frequency from the rest of us during the entire exchange. Room 237 was at the end of a long, narrow hallway that, in the dark lights above, seemed to go on forever. This carpet was a sickly green that made me think of hospital scrubs, which was distinct from the colour downstairs. As I proceeded, I observed there were out-of-order signs pinned to a number of doors, and there were what appeared to be water, damage stains leaking down one of them. The air conditioner buzzed noisily from the ceiling, but it was only this stale recycled noise, and not really cool. When I eventually arrived at my room, the key was in the air that tasted metallic on my tongue, the card required for attempts to function, and the door itself became stuck as if the frame were deformed. The interior wasn't much better than a queen. A tiny desk fastened to the wall, a bed with a duvet that had seen better days, and the bathroom. That was hardly large. The worst thing was the smell, which wasn't really mold, but it was enough to turn around. I opened the one window, but it wasn't precisely decay, but there was something natural and unnatural that seemed to emanate from the walls. Hoping for some fresh air, but the screen was ripped and it only opened about 3 inches. Beyond the parking lot, I could make out a row of deserted buildings that had formerly been a shopping centre. My bed case files had the tournament documents strewn all over them. I had spent months refining my research notes, argument outlines, and everything I had worked for was depending on the next 3 days, so I made an effort to concentrate on the preparation than the nagging discomfort that had taken hold of my chest. The desk lamp projected around 11 p.m. There was a strong white light that made everything appear sickly and washed out. I was thoroughly reviewing when I first heard my rebuttals. I heard a clear but muffled voice. I initially believed it might be the TV from the adjacent room coming from the wall behind the headboard, but I could hear someone speaking in a low, agitated voice as I listened more intently. The tone was unmistakably one of fear and despair, even though it was difficult to hear the words over the thin walls. I pushed my ear to the cool paint and held my breath, trying to hear the voice of someone pleading. Appeared to be coming from the room next to mine, 238. The person speaking sounded serious. The whisper immediately stopped, leaving only the distant sound of the air conditioner humming and traffic. I waited for maybe 10 minutes with my ears pushed against the wall. When it didn't, I told myself that I was merely anxious about the event, possibly hearing things that weren't there. But they became more apparent around midnight. Please don't let them in this time. The words were so clear that I thought the speaker was standing directly next to me. When I realized someone was truly distressed, my heart began to race. The voice sounded youthful, possibly even younger than myself, and it was only a few feet from where I was seated. My skin crawled from the sheer dread in it, so I reached for my phone to call the front desk, but I paused, wondering if I was mistaken, and it was actually just a TV, or I chose to investigate the hallway first after speaking with someone on the phone. Seemed eerier at night, when just 1 out of 3 light bulbs were on, and shadows gathered in the corners, like building. As I walked to room 238, my bare feet were silent on the wet carpet, and the door looked much like mine. The electronic lock, peephole, and forward grain were all the same, yet as I drew nearer, I observed an oddity. No light was coming from beneath the door, and there were no television or movement noises. The room seemed to be absorbing sound instead of creating it, and the silence was so total that it was suffocating. I was about to say, "Hey, I heard you," but I stopped myself. I thought it was crazy that they were pleading for assistance through the wall, but the memories. I pressed forward after hearing that fearful voice, and I knocked softly at the first 3 soft taps that seemed to reverberate down the vacant hallway. No answer, so I tried again, shouting a little louder this time, whisperingly, "Hey, is everything all right in there?" Nothing had changed, and the quiet continued, solely disturbed by the different mechanical noises coming from the building, such as pipes settling, elevator shaft creaking, and the ice maker. I put my ear to the door while churning at the far end of the hall in the hopes of hearing something that would verify that there was a person inside. But there was no sound, not even the sound of breath. or activity. It seemed as though the space was entirely vacant, which was absurd. Considering what I had heard minutes earlier, I knocked again, more forcefully this time, and waited. When no one replied, I returned to my room grudgingly, but I kept my door slightly open so I might hear any additional noises from the next door after that. I was unable to sleep and lay in bed, gazing at the ceiling all the while, as the digital clock on the nightstand gleamed red in the darkness. Nerves were on high alert, waiting for the voice to return. Darkness at 1:47 a.m., followed by 2:23 3:15 a.m. or a minute passed like an I heard slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway at around 3:30. I held my breath just outside my door, wondering if anyone could see the narrow strip of light beneath my door for what seemed like an eternity. The footfall lingered before continuing downward. I crept to the peephole, though waiting for 10 more minutes, but the corridor was once more deserted. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath, as if the structure were waiting for something horrible to happen. Only the sound of my own fast heartbeat could be heard in my ears after conditioning had stopped. 4:17 a.m. when the voice returned. It was different this time. It was more urgent. They are attempting to enter, so please, someone, don't let them in. I immediately sprung up in bed, because the words were so clear that it felt like the speaker was speaking straight into my ear. Adrenaline racing through my system. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was actually in distress next door. I grabbed dial 911 on my phone, but as soon as the operator responded, I understood how crazy I'd say, "Hey, I hear voices through a hotel wall." I hung up and phoned the front desk, but they thought I was having a mental breakdown. The phone kept ringing. However, Norman must have been asleep or moved away, because no one picked him up. I made 3 more attempts, but to no avail. The incessant ringing that reverberated throughout the deserted lobby below made it impossible for me to do nothing but lie there while someone was. I put on some clothing, begged for assistance, and went downstairs to look for Norman, or whoever worked the night shift. Found the lobby hauntingly dark, illuminated solely by the front desk was deserted, but I could still see a coffee mug in the dim security lighting, and the glimmer of the vending machines steaming behind the counter, so I screamed out hello, assuming someone was there. Repeatedly without receiving a response. There was a staff-only door beyond the desk, so I went around and knocked. Norman then showed up, appearing much more unkempt than before, with his hair sticking up in strange places and a bewildered expression on his face. His eyes, as though I had just roused him from a deep slumber. When I began to describe the voice from room 238 years before I had finished, his face dramatically transformed, losing all of its color, and he began to shake his head. He continued saying, "No, no, no," as he backed away from me, as though I was, quote, "Room 238 is locked and has had water damage from the pipe 4 months. Exploded in the winter of last year." He was now wringing his hands, and even though the foyer was empty, I could see perspiration dripping down his brow. Very cold. No one has been inside since March. We closed it off due to the mold, but I was aware of what I had heard. His cries for assistance were sincere, and I asked him for further information. "Norman, why was there no warning sign on the door, and why wasn't the room appropriately designated as out of order like the others?" Simply continued to shake his head and mutter about how the room ought to be empty, because it was supposed to be empty. His actions were making my skin crawl. His eyes were filled with genuine horror, as if he understood precisely what I was talking about, but refused to acknowledge it, insisting on returning upstairs while I held a huge ring of keys. It jangled with each step, making the elevator journey seem endless. With his tense breathing and the old lift's mechanical moans, Norman proceeded down the corridor as if he were making his way to his own execution. When we arrived at room 238 on the 2nd level, he struggled for what seemed like an eternity with the keys, trying a few before he found the correct one. "See," he said as he twisted the key. His voice was hardly audible above a whisper. Empty, been empty 4 months. The door opened, revealing total darkness and an overpowering stench that included not only mold, but Norman scrambled for a light switch, feeling something more natural and profound. When the eye could see why he had been so afraid as a solitary overhead light flicked on. The room was damaged ceiling tiles that are hanging down, black mold that covers the entire wall, and furniture that is heaped carelessly in the worst part of the wall was not that someone had attempted to barricade themselves in the center. Someone has used their frantic, sharp fingernails to scrape words into the plaster near my room. "Help me, and don't let them in," were written in letters. Repeatedly, Norman noticed me gazing. The scratches were deep, as if the person who made them had clawed at the wall until their fingers bled. "Water damage," he repeated anxiously as he glanced at the wall and swiftly turned out the lights, escorting me out of the room. "Just water damage, sometimes the pipes make noises," we said, locking the door behind us. "You know, it sounds like voices from an ancient building." But his justification collapsed when, as he pocketed the keys, I saw his hands shaking. We returned to my room in total quiet, and I felt him observing me as I shut my door. And I sat in the window chair for the remainder of the night, terrified to go. Terrified to sleep next to the wall, because I'm worried about what more I could hear in the morning. Arrived.